welcome to this video on the basics of how to get the perfect exposure. We're going to be talking about ISO, shutter speed, and aperture, and why, of course, you need to nail your exposure every time, and how it's actually really easy. So there's three main things that control the exposure in your camera. There's ISO, which is the sensitivity of your sensor, basically how sensitive to light it is. So more sensitive, it'll gather more light. Less sensitive, it'll gather less light. But with a less sensitive or a lower ISO, you're going to get higher image quality. So with landscape photography, we're almost always trying to shoot at the lowest possible ISO, or your base ISO. Typically with this camera it's ISO 100, with others it is ISO 64 or ISO 125 in some cases. The next component of the exposure triangle is shutter speed, and basically there is a piece of metal inside of the camera body, and it opens and closes for a certain amount of time, and that lets through light. So obviously the longer you leave it open, the more light will come through. The last component is called aperture, and inside the lens there is a series of rings, a diaphragm basically, and the wider that those go, or wider aperture, will let in more light to the camera. So basically you're trying to balance all of these three factors in order to get a proper exposure. Now of course there's knock-on effects to the image quality and what the image looks like depending on what you change. So for instance, a quick easy example is with shutter speed. If you prolong your shutter speed and get into the multiple seconds, then of course if something's moving it's going to blur, and you're not going to get a sharp photograph. Likewise with ISO, a higher ISO leads to more digital noise, and with aperture, a wide open aperture, i.e. a lower number, f1.8 for instance, will give you less depth of field. So that refers to how much of the image is in focus from front to back, basically. So typically with landscape photography, we're going to be shooting at our base ISO, in this case ISO 100, with a low aperture because we want lots of things in focus from front to back, and then we determine the correct exposure by adjusting the shutter speed. So those are the basics of the exposure triangle. Now I'm going to set up and make a photograph of the scene behind me with these beautiful backlit beech leaves, and we can see the effects of underexposure, overexposure, and what that looks like in the final resulting image. It's a fairly complex scene in terms of exposure. The sun's casting some deeper shadows, and it's also backlighting those leaves, causing some bright highlights. So we do have to be very careful here with our exposure. So two more things that you need to get to grips with to get a perfect exposure every time. And the first is your camera's light meter and how that works. Now typically it will be an average metering or a matrix metering, depending on the camera brand, they call it different things. And basically what that does is your camera will read most or the entire scene and give you an average of those values, which it determines as the correct exposure. There's of course other versions of metering like spot or sensor weighted, and those read a smaller portion of the frame to determine your exposure. But for the most part, I would leave it in that average or matrix metering. The other really useful tool to get to know how to use is called a histogram. And basically it's a chart of all the values in your photograph determined from black to white, as if it was grayscale. So all the way at 0 is pure black and 255 is pure white. So it gives you a reading from 0 to 255 of the values in your image. So at a glance you can look at your histogram and see if everything's over to the right, then you might be overexposed. So it's a really useful tool to get a quick and easy check of if you're over or underexposing your image. Why might you want to over or underexpose? So a good example is the scene that I'm shooting here. If I take some video here, I can show you the beech leaves are very bright because they're being backlit by the sun. And then on the left we have this quite dark tree trunk, and that's of course in the shadow. So in this instance I'm being very careful to not blow the highlights. Effectively what that means is digital sensors, as soon as you go above 255, they can no longer record color and detail. So it's very important to not overexpose your images using a digital camera. And these days, using modern cameras, shadow recovery is really excellent. So don't be afraid to slightly underexpose your images for the sake of saving some of those highlight details. And of course, this scene is no exception. I'm underexposing it by 1 1/3 or 1 2/3 of a stop. Correctly expose this scene according to my camera's light meter, that would be f8 at 1/40th of a second. So I'll take a frame and show you what that looks like. I'll also take a frame here at 1 stop overexposed to show you just how fast the digital sensor degrades the image when you overexpose. And then lastly, I'll do an underexposed frame here at 1 1/3. That's what I'm determining as my correct exposure, actually, in order to preserve those highlight details, and then I can lift the shadows in post-processing. So looking at the histogram, I can tell that everything's over to the left. There's nothing clipping, there's no blown highlights, and that way I'm going to achieve a perfect exposure every single time. So to wrap things up, for landscape photographers, generally we're shooting at our base ISO. We're setting the correct aperture for how much depth of field we want. Do we want the image in focus from front to back? Then we're going to use something like f8 to f11. And then using the camera's light meter, we're going to determine the correct shutter speed. And of course, that's where using a tripod comes in handy if you have a very long shutter speed to get a sharp image. And then of course, to use your histogram effectively will help you to achieve better exposures when you're out in the field. Thanks everyone for watching. I hope this has been a helpful video for the exposure triangle and for metering a scene and getting the correct exposure. If you've enjoyed the video, then please do remember to click the like button down below, leave us a comment, and subscribe to the PicFair YouTube channel. Thanks so much. We'll see you in the next one. Cheers.